air out here, way out where the pavement gave up and became a gravel track snaking through stands of pine and oak, was something Jonathan had only ever dreamed of. It was crisp, sharp, with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a living thing that filled his lungs and scoured away the lingering taint of city smog. 2 months he'd been in this place. 2 months since they'd packed up their cramped suburban tract home and driven west, chasing the phantom of quietude Jonathan had built in his mind. He'd built the house, too, with his own hands mostly, laying every plank and shingle with a craftsman's pride. It wasn't a mansion, just a sturdy 3-bedroom log-style cabin nestled right up against the sprawling wilderness of the national park, where the mountain river, cold and clear, tumbled over moss-slicked stones a few hundred yards from their back porch. Sarah had been all smiles, her face bronzed by the unexpected summer sun, her usually tense shoulders finally relaxed. She'd always loved the idea of a simple life, a place where their 10-year-old daughter, Lisa, could run free without Jonathan constantly barking warnings about traffic or strangers. Lisa, all spindly legs and wide, curious eyes, had taken to the woods like a fawn, her bright laughter echoing through the trees as she chased butterflies or skipped stones across the river. They'd spent evenings by a crackling bonfire, the smoke curling up into a sky so black and studded with stars it almost hurt to look. The silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, or the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what Jonathan had wanted, what they had needed, an antidote to the ceaseless hum of stress that had plagued their old life. Jonathan, a hunter since his teenage years, had quickly fallen back into old rhythms. He knew the woods, understood the language of the deer trails and the whisper of the wind through the pines. He'd bagged a decent 6-point buck on an early morning hunt, the venison now neatly wrapped in their freezer, a testament to the bounty of their new surroundings. It felt good, right, to provide for his family in this primal way, to feel the weight of his rifle in his hands, not for sport, but for sustenance. Then the smell started. It began subtly, an insidious undercurrent on certain nights when the breeze shifted. At first, Jonathan dismissed it as nothing more than a dead animal, a deer caught in a thicket, slowly returning to the earth. But as the weeks bled into each other, the smell grew more insistent, more wrong. It wasn't the sweet, cloying decay of a bloated carcass, nor the sharp tang of a fox's den. This was something different, something chemical, a metallic blend of blood, rust, and rot, a suffocating miasma. It wafted in through open windows, especially on those warm, still nights, making the air feel thick and heavy, pressing down on the house. He went out onto the porch, his old hunting dog Chester bristling beside him, and attempted to pinpoint its source. But it always emanated from the deeper parts of the woods, a phantom odor that vanished with the morning light. A few days later, Chester was gone. No bark, no struggle, just an empty dog bed and a faint, acrid scent near the tree line. Jonathan searched for days, calling his name until his throat was raw, but the woods offered only silence. His disappearance was the first real crack in their idyllic facade, a cold premonition of what was to come. Sometimes Jonathan even thought he could detect a faint trace of the putrid smell rising from the old earthen basement, a deeper, more rooted corruption beneath the floorboards. Just a coon, he'd tell Sarah, watching her wrinkle her nose as she closed the bedroom window. But he knew better. This wasn't natural. During his infrequent trips into the small, dusty town for supplies, Jonathan started to pick up on things. Little threads of unease woven into the fabric of local chatter. The hardware store owner, a grizzled old man named Al with eyes that had seen too much, mentioned in a low voice that the woman named Henderson's prize-winning collie had gone missing. Just vanished right off her porch, plain as day, Al had grumbled, polishing a horseshoe. No bark, no struggle, just gone. In the diner, over lukewarm coffee and a slice of apple pie, Jonathan heard snippets of conversation from the farmers huddled in a booth by the window. They spoke in hushed tones about unusual wolf sightings, packs emboldened, no longer fearing humans, venturing too close to their barns, taking livestock in broad daylight. Their faces, usually ruddy and weathered, looked pale, drawn, etched with a tension that mirrored the knot in Jonathan's own gut. He caught a flash of genuine fear in their eyes, a look he understood from his hunting days. The look of a creature aware it was being stalked by something bigger, something it could not outrun. Then came the news about McGregor's dog. McGregor, a lean, taciturn man who ran a small cattle farm a few miles north, hadn't been one for idle talk. So when Jonathan saw him in the general store, McGregor's usually stoic face was a mask of raw, visceral terror. His Irish setter, a big, shaggy dog named Rusty, had been found mangled beyond recognition in his own yard. Not eaten, McGregor had choked out, his voice hoarse, his eyes red-rimmed. Not like a wolf, not like a bear. Just ripped apart, like it was pure hate. The words hung in the air, heavy and dark. A stone dropped into the placid pond of their new life. A few nights later, the illusion of peace shattered completely. Jonathan, Sarah, and Lisa were jolted awake by a sound that tore through the pre-dawn quiet like a jagged blade. It was a howl, yes, but unlike any wolf's cry he'd ever heard. It was too long, too guttural, too filled with a chilling primal agony and a raw, terrible hunger. It wasn't a lone wolf calling to its pack, nor the yapping chorus of coyotes. This was a single, sustained note of pure, unadulterated dread, a sound that scraped against the very bones of the world. And it was close. Too close. Whatever made that sound stood just beyond the tree line, its breath fogging the bedroom window. Lisa, a tiny bundle of tremors, immediately scrambled out of her bed and burrowed under Jonathan's covers, her small body shaking uncontrollably against his. Sarah, usually so unflappable, was equally terrified. She clutched Jonathan's arm, her fingers digging into his bicep, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her eyes, wide and dark in the gloom, pleaded with him for an explanation he couldn't give. He held them both, his own heart thudding a desperate rhythm against his ribs, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. The howl faded, leaving behind an echoing silence that was almost worse. A vast, empty space, waiting to be filled by something unspeakable. Morning brought a false sense of security, the sun pouring down, washing away the horrors of the night. But the memory of that howl lingered, a cold hand on Jonathan's neck. He took Lisa down to the mountain river, seeking to soothe her frayed nerves with the familiar sound of rushing water and birdsong. They walked along the bank, Lisa skipping ahead, carefully avoiding the muddy patches. Then Jonathan saw them. Right there, on a patch of soft, damp earth near the water's edge, were tracks unlike anything he'd ever encountered. They were enormous, easily twice the size of a large dog's paw print, with incredibly long, sharp claws that had dug deep, distinct furrows into the soil. But here was the truly unsettling part. There were no distinct paw pads. Something incredibly heavy, with feet made of solid, clawed bone, had pressed down. The tracks led deeper into the woods, towards a thicket of tangled undergrowth. Curious, a cold knot tightening in his stomach, Jonathan followed them, Lisa trailing a few steps behind, her usual exuberance replaced by a quiet wariness. He found it in the thicket, the remains of a wild goat, mostly bone, but it wasn't gnawed clean by scavengers or picked apart by predators. The bones were unusually white, polished, stripped of flesh by a strange, corrosive process. There wasn't a single drop of blood to be seen anywhere, no messy signs of a struggle, just clean bone. And around the remains, faint but unmistakable, was that same sickly, metallic, rotting smell, far more potent than he'd ever encountered before. It clung to the air, a putrid, tangible presence that warped the very sunlight. Jonathan felt a shiver trace its way down his spine, prickling the hairs on his arms. This was no wolf, no bear. This was something else entirely, something utterly alien and terrifying, and it was right here, in their woods, closer than he ever wanted to imagine. The stillness of their new life had been a lie, and the stirring had just begun. The sound was a raw, sickening crunch like bone against gristle, followed by a wet, tearing rip. Jonathan shot upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, a cold sweat instantly beading on his forehead. It had been just outside, close enough to make the thin wall of their cabin feel like tissue paper. A low, guttural growl, then that repulsive, tearing sound again as something huge and ravenous feasted. He glanced at the digital clock beside his bed. 3:17 a.m. The moon, a sliver of silver, offered little comfort through the curtains. He swung his legs out of bed, grabbing the heavy-duty aluminum flashlight from the nightstand. His old hunting carbine, a potent deer rifle, always leaned against the wall next to his dresser. Ready and waiting. He checked the action, ensuring a round was chambered, the cold metal a familiar reassurance in his trembling hands. Sarah was already awake, sitting bolt upright, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. Lisa, thank God, hadn't stirred yet. Her small, even breaths a fragile counterpoint to the monstrous sounds outside. He crept to the living room window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. The motion sensor light he'd installed near the back porch hadn't triggered. Whatever was out there was moving in the shadows. It was simply too low for the sensor to pick up. He swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear coating his tongue. Stepping onto the back porch, Jonathan swept the beam of his flashlight across the immediate yard. The familiar landscape of their quiet haven now felt menacing, every shadow a lurking place. Then he saw it. Their metal trash can, the heavy-gauge galvanized steel bin they'd bought specifically to keep out bears and raccoons, was lying on its side completely torn open. Not merely knocked over, but ripped, jagged edges of steel protruding like cruel teeth. Its contents, plastic bags, food scraps, a few empty aluminum cans, were scattered across the dewy grass. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a disturbing detail. Huge, dark clumps of matted fur, thick and coarse, lay scattered amidst the refuse, some stained with a dark, glistening fluid that was blood. The air was thick with the reek of spilled garbage, but beneath it, Strong and nauseating was that same chemical, metallic odor of decay he'd noticed for weeks, now concentrated and unbearable. He lowered the beam to the ground. The tracks were unmistakable. Massive imprints leading directly from the wrecked trash can towards the house, then abruptly veering around the corner, heading straight for Lisa's bedroom window. Jonathan's stomach lurched. He dropped to one knee, examining the prints more closely. They were enormous, easily the size of his outstretched hand, with long, wickedly sharp claws that had scored deep furrows into the hard-packed earth. But the most disturbing feature remained. No distinct paw pads. The imprints were broad, amorphous. An immense clawed fist had pressed down. The claws, unnervingly long and slender, were not like a bear's blunt digging tools, nor a wolf's elegant tearing instruments. These were like the talons of an enormous predatory bird, but set into a foot far too heavy for flight. He followed the tracks to the corner of the house. There, under Lisa's window, was a smear of dried, dark blood on the clapboard siding, just above the window ledge, and another clump of the coarse black fur clinging to a splintered piece of wood. Whatever had been out there had been right there, pressing its enormous body against the house, sniffing, listening, and watching. A cold dread, far deeper than simple fear, coiled in Jonathan's gut. This wasn't some random animal encounter. This was something targeted. The following day, Jonathan went into overdrive. As a former builder, he possessed a formidable array of tools and a practical hands-on mindset. Something lurked in the woods, and he was going to find out what it was. He drove back to town, ignoring Sarah's worried questions, and returned with a small arsenal of outdoor security equipment. A half-dozen motion-activated infrared trail cameras, the kind hunters use to track game. He spent the rest of the day meticulously positioning them. 2 were hidden high in the pines at the edge of their clearing, overlooking the main approaches to the house. Another was camouflaged near the mangled trash can, pointed directly at the spot where the tracks had appeared. He even installed one discreetly beneath Lisa's bedroom window, its small, unblinking lens a silent guardian. The last 2 covered the other sides of the house, ensuring a full 360-degree perimeter. He ran thin wires, carefully concealed, to a small monitor in his study, where he could review the footage. He felt a grim satisfaction as he completed his work, a sense of reclaiming some control. The first 3 nights were uneventful, a blur of rustling leaves, the occasional deer grazing in the yard, a curious raccoon sniffing at the now-repaired trash can. Jonathan spent hours poring over the footage, the silence of the night broken only by the faint hum of the hard drive, a growing knot of disappointment tightening in his chest. He almost convinced himself it had just been a rogue bear, a particularly aggressive wolf. He almost allowed himself to believe it. Then came the 4th night. He was in his study, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring at the monitor, when the image flickered. The infrared mode cast everything in an eerie, monochromatic glow, turning the familiar woods into a spectral landscape. For a split second, a blur of motion. He rewound the footage, his breath catching in his throat. There. It was only a few seconds, jerky and indistinct, but it was enough. Several figures, impossibly tall, moved through the trees at the edge of the clearing. They were bipedal, standing on 2 powerful legs, their bodies heavily muscled, grotesquely so. Their forms were vaguely humanoid, but the heads were undeniably wolf-like, elongated snouts, sharp, pointed ears, But the movement was wrong. It wasn't the stiff, lumbering gait of a bear or the lithe lope of a wolf. It had an eerie, fluid plasticity, a subtle shift of weight that spoke of intelligence, of a frightening, unnatural grace. And then he saw the eyes. 2 pinpricks of yellow light, glowing with a predatory intensity in the dark, unblinking, utterly devoid of anything human. They moved in a slow, deliberate circle around the house, like dark, hungry shadows. They weren't rushing, weren't charging. They were studying. Each creature moved with a chilling purpose, occasionally pausing, their heads cocked, listening to something beyond human hearing. One of them, the largest, stopped directly in front of the camera, hidden in the pine tree. Its head slowly turned, those yellow eyes burning with a conscious awareness, staring directly into the lens. A low, guttural sound, too distorted to be a growl, too deep to be a whimper, pulsed through the microphone. A sound Jonathan later realized was a perverse, knowing chuckle. Then, with a sudden, violent swipe, the camera screen went black. The feed abruptly cut. The monster, with an unnerving precision, didn't just smash it, but deliberately tore out the memory card, leaving the mangled device behind as a warning. Jonathan stared at the frozen image of the black screen, his hands clammy, a cold, sickening wave of panic washing over him. He rewound the footage again, watched those few terrifying seconds, then again and again, a dozen times. He tried to rationalize it, tried to convince himself it was a trick of light, a glitch. He considered it a bear, standing on its hind legs. But the images were too clear, too specific, too utterly monstrous. These were not bears, these were not wolves. These were something else, something from a nightmare made flesh, creatures that moved with an intelligence far beyond mere animal instinct. He felt a primal scream bubbling up from his gut, but he choked it down. Sarah and Lisa were asleep down the hall, their innocent breaths a fragile counterpoint to the horror he had just witnessed. He couldn't tell them. Not yet. He had to be strong. He had to protect them. But the feeling of icy dread was like a physical weight on his chest, constricting his breathing. Sarah had noticed his changed behavior, his jumpiness, the way he flinched at every creak of the old house. "Everything all right, John?" she'd asked, her brow furrowed with concern. He'd brushed her off, blaming stress, the difficulty of adjusting to rural life. A lie, and a poor one. The next day, Jonathan moved with a renewed, manic energy. He boarded up all the windows on the ground floor, installing heavy iron shutters over the glass. He reinforced the doors with additional deadbolts and heavy-duty steel bars. He dragged out every firearm he owned. His hunting carbine, a pump-action shotgun, a revolver. Laid them out on the kitchen table. Meticulously cleaned and oiled each one, loading magazines and shotgun tubes with military precision. Thousands of rounds of ammunition sat stacked neatly in metal boxes. He was preparing for war. As he worked, a chilling certainty settled over him. They weren't alone. And whatever they were, they had shown too much interest in this house, in them. The glowing yellow eyes, the human-like posture, the deliberate destruction of the camera. It all spoke of an intelligence, a malevolence that transcended any wild animal. They were watching, they were waiting, and they were coming back. Jonathan called Sheriff Brody first thing in the morning, his voice tight with an urgency he couldn't quite mask. He described the mangled trash can, the inexplicable tracks, the strange fur, the impossible smell. He left out the most terrifying part, the part about the things on two legs and the glowing yellow eyes, trying to keep his narrative grounded in a reality the lawman might accept. "Sounds like a big old bear, Jonathan," Brody drawled, his voice thick with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who'd seen it all and wasn't easily impressed. "It sounds like a pack of wolves. They have been getting bolder lately. They were starving." Yet, a flicker of something unreadable, something beyond mere skepticism, crossed his faded blue eyes. A subtle shift in his posture, a tightening of his jaw, hinted at a deeper understanding he chose not to voice. "Sheriff, these weren't bear tracks," Jonathan insisted, his patience fraying. "And not wolves. These were different, massive. And the way they tore open that steel can, that wasn't no bear." Brody sighed, a long, weary sound that conveyed his skepticism more effectively than any words. "Look, I'll swing by. Got a call about a missing dog near the old Miller place anyway. I will kill 2 birds." When Brody finally showed up, driving his beat-up Ford pickup truck with the county logo barely visible on the door, it was late afternoon. He was a barrel-chested man in his late 50s, his face a road map of sun-creased wrinkles, his eyes a faded blue behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a uniform shirt, but his holster was empty, the belt loosely cinched around his ample waist. He looked less like a lawman and more like a farmer who'd reluctantly donned a costume. He ambled around the perimeter of the house, kicking at the scattered trash, grunting non-committally at the deep scratches on the wooden walls. "Yup, it was a bear, all right," he announced, wiping a hand across his mouth. "Big fella, too. They get pretty strong when they're desperate." His gaze lingered, however, on the immense, ragged tears in the heavy-gauge steel trash can, a look of grim recognition briefly shadowing his face before he forced it away. Jonathan finally pointed to the damaged camera, now just a mangled mess of wires and plastic lying useless in the grass. "And this, Sheriff, something tore this off the tree and smashed it." Brody picked it up, turned it over in his hand, then tossed it back down. "Something tried to get at whatever was inside," he stated. "They are curious creatures. It was likely a squirrel." His voice, however, lacked its earlier conviction, and he avoided Jonathan's gaze, his eyes scanning the dense tree line with an unnerving intensity. He shrugged. "You city folks, you ain't used to the wild, son. Things are different out here." "I'm not from the city, Sheriff," Jonathan corrected, his voice flat. "I grew up hunting. I know what a bear track looks like. I know what a wolf does. This isn't that." He pulled out his laptop, desperate. "I've got footage, Sheriff. Real footage. I caught them on camera." He navigated to the file, his fingers trembling slightly. But when he tried to open it, an error message flashed across the screen. "File corrupted. Cannot open." Jonathan felt a cold despair wash over him. He tried another file, then another. They were all corrupted. The crucial footage of the creatures, the few seconds of terrifying clarity, had been meticulously overwritten with static or simply deleted. Others contained only a few seconds of blurry, static-filled images, indistinguishable blurs that Brody immediately dismissed as any wild animal moving in poor light. The one crucial file, the one showing the creature staring directly into the lens, was gone, completely deleted, erased from the drive as if it never existed. The creatures hadn't just destroyed the camera. They had understood its purpose and systematically eliminated the evidence. Brody watched him with a pitying, almost patronizing smile. "See? That was just static interference. These fancy gadgets are not always reliable out here in the boonies. I tell you what, I'll keep an eye out, but you just make sure your trash is put away and try not to worry so much. You'll scare the missus." He clapped Jonathan on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than an offer of help. "It's just nature, son. You'll get used to it." The sheriff climbed back into his truck, the engine sputtering to life, and drove away, leaving Jonathan standing in the silence, a profound sense of isolation settling over him. As he drove away, Jonathan caught a final glimpse of the sheriff in his rearview mirror. Brody wasn't looking at the house or the road. His eyes were fixed on the dense, dark woods, a deep, unsettling fear etched onto his weathered face. The authorities, the very people sworn to protect, saw only what they wanted to see, what their limited understanding of the world allowed. They were blind. He spent the next few days in a feverish, obsessive state. With no help from official channels, he turned to the internet, determined to find some explanation, some similar incidents in the region. He typed in keywords: unusual animal attacks, large bipedal creatures, glowing eyes, metallic smell. He found a dizzying array of cryptid forums, grainy, blurry photographs, and ancient urban legends about Sasquatch and cryptid humanoid sightings. It was all too fantastical, too outlandish. His practical, grounded mind rejected it, even as the images from his own camera haunted his waking thoughts. There was no scientific explanation, no comforting category for what he had seen. He tightened his security even further. The heavy iron shutters he'd ordered now covered every window, their thick steel a cold, unyielding barrier. He hammered long, thick nails into the window sills, adding another layer of defense. He spent hours patrolling the perimeter, his shotgun slung over his shoulder, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, his ears straining for any unnatural sound. He tried to create an illusion of safety for Sarah and Lisa, constantly telling them, "See? We're protected now. Nothing's getting in." But even as he spoke the words, a cold voice in the back of his mind whispered that this was just the beginning. That night the creatures returned. This time, they came without the pretense of stealth. The air vibrated with their presence, a palpable, malicious energy that pressed against the house from all sides. Jonathan, Sarah, and Lisa were huddled in the living room, a single lamp casting long, nervous shadows. They heard the first impact, a sickening crunch as the repaired metal trash can was once again obliterated, this time with a savage, unrestrained fury. Then came the sounds on the house itself. Deep, tearing scratches as something gargantuan raked its claws down the wooden siding. The house shuddered under repeated impacts, heavy thuds that made the very foundations tremble. Jonathan grabbed his shotgun, his hands sweating. He peered through a narrow slit he'd left in the shutters of a window overlooking the backyard. In the faint moonlight he saw them, multiple enormous dark forms moving with an eerie, silent grace, circling the house like sharks. They were taller than any man, their shoulders broad, their heads perpetually lowered, sniffing at the walls, their powerful bodies pressing against the wood. Deep, dark gouges appeared on the siding, splinters flying as their claws dug in, searching for a weakness. Then the sound started, close and terrifying. Not just the physical impacts, but noises that clawed at the edges of sanity. A low, guttural growl, like a massive engine idling deep within their chests. And then, a sound that made the blood run cold in Jonathan's veins. A series of short, sharp whimpers, like a human moan, distorted and broken, echoing through the night. Lisa, who had been trying to be brave, suddenly burst into tears, burying her face in Sarah's chest. "The big toothy shadows," she sobbed, her small voice choked with terror. "They're back. They want to get in." Jonathan watched, a grim realization dawning on him. One of the silhouettes stood at the very edge of the clearing, a motionless sentinel, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on the house, while the others continued their methodical assault. It wasn't a random, chaotic attack. It was organized. It was deliberate. They weren't just wild animals responding to instinct. They were conducting a siege, studying their defenses, testing their resolve, slowly, methodically, pushing them to the brink. They were learning. And Jonathan knew, with a terrifying certainty, that they were waiting for the right moment to break in. Desperate, feeling the weight of the sheriff's skepticism like a stone around his neck, Jonathan decided to seek answers where logic had failed. He drove back to the small town, leaving Sarah and Lisa barricaded in the house, a grim promise to return as soon as possible hanging heavy in the air. He tried to be subtle, casual, asking around at the diner, the hardware store, the gas station about any other strange occurrences. Most people offered vague shrugs and knowing glances, their eyes darting away quickly. The fear was palpable, a quiet hum beneath the surface of their everyday lives. Finally, he found himself outside a ramshackle cabin on the fringes of the deep woods, miles from any paved road. It was the home of Silas, an old woodsman legendary for his eccentricity and his deep, unsettling connection to the forest. Silas was a gaunt, stoop-shouldered man with a tangled white beard and eyes like chips of flint, deeply recessed and sharp. He smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, something wild and unwashed. He barely looked up when Jonathan knocked, but an ancient, weathered face peered out from the gloom within. "Heard you were asking about things," Silas rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across a porch. He gestured for Jonathan to come in. The cabin was a dimly lit, cluttered space, crammed with oddments. Cured animal skins, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, dusty books stacked haphazardly, and a collection of strangely carved wooden totems. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, tobacco, and something faintly acrid, like burnt herbs. Jonathan recounted his experiences, leaving out the most impossible details, but conveying the sheer terror he felt. Silas listened, his head cocked, occasionally nodding. When Jonathan mentioned the putrid metallic smell, Silas's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something ancient and terrible passing through them. "Aye," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible. "The old gods of the forest. They stir when the veil thins, when the blood calls." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his breath stale and warm against Jonathan's ear. "They walk, you see, in the shadows. Been happening a long time. People disappear. Animals too. The forest just takes them." He rambled on about hungry times when the forest was particularly ravenous, about walking shadows that stole souls and flesh. His words were a chaotic jumble of folk tales, superstitions, and genuine bone-deep fear. He spoke of ancient spirits, of a world beneath their own, of things that blurred the line between man and beast, things that had always been here, simply waiting for their moment. "They leave marks?" Silas murmured, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen horror. "Clean bones, no blood. They take it all, you see. The essence, the life." He spoke of a particular abandoned farm, the McGregor place, where an entire family had vanished decades ago, leaving behind only strange rumors and a chilling silence. The forest claimed it, he said, then added, "Some places just draw them in." His gaze, when it met Jonathan's, was filled with an ancient, unblinking terror, a fear born of generations of whispered legends and unspeakable truths. The next day, driven by Silas's cryptic warnings and a desperate need for answers, Jonathan decided to investigate the abandoned farm Silas had mentioned. He told Sarah he was going scouting for deer, the lie feeling thin and brittle. The old McGregor place was a skeletal ruin, its barns sagging, its farmhouse windows like vacant eyes staring out at the overgrown fields. A rusty, barbed wire fence, long broken, sagged around the perimeter. He found it immediately. The main gate to the property was not just open, but ripped clean off its hinges, lying twisted and gnarled in the tall grass. Inside the cow barn, a cavernous, dust-filled space. The air was still and stale, but underneath the layers of decay, that same metallic, putrid smell lingered, a faint but unmistakable echo. There were no cattle, no signs of recent life, only old, sun-bleached hay. But on the dirt floor, beneath a broken feeder, Jonathan found them. Several dried, dark stains that were blood, long since caked in black. And near them, small clumps of thick, dark fur, coarser and more matted than any cattle hide he'd ever felt, caught in the splintered wood. Whatever had been here, it had been savage, and it had been the same kind of creature that had visited his home. As he drove home, the late afternoon sun casting long, ominous shadows, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He kept glancing in his rearview mirror, but there was nothing, just the empty gravel road behind him. Then, as he neared the turnoff to his own property, he caught it. A flicker of movement deep within the pines, right at the boundary of the national parkland. It was indistinct, a dark shape against the deepening green, but it was too tall, too upright, to be any normal animal. It was gone in an instant, a phantom in his peripheral vision, but the image seared itself into his mind. They were watching him, even during the day. The thought sent a fresh wave of paranoia crashing over him, stripping away any last vestige of peace he clung to. Lisa's nightmares, which had started as whimpers in the night, now escalated into full-blown terror. She would wake up screaming, her small face streaked with tears, thrashing against Sarah's comforting embrace. She described big toothy dogs with eyes like a campfire, their yellow glow burning in the darkness. But the most disturbing detail was her repeated insistence that they were trying to take something from under the ground. "They're digging, Daddy," she'd sob, her voice thin and reedy. "They're trying to take it." Sarah was beside herself, trying to soothe their daughter. But Jonathan could see the raw fear in her own eyes, the way she now jumped at every creak of the house, the dark circles under her eyes deepening with each sleepless night. Jonathan and Sarah had made a silent pact not to tell Lisa what they had seen on the cameras. They also withheld his mounting suspicions. They clung to the frayed edges of normalcy, trying to maintain a semblance of control. But the tension in the house was a living thing, a coiled serpent that tightened with every passing hour. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, every shadow that danced in the lamplight sent shivers down their spines. The phone calls started coming in from the few scattered farmers and homesteaders further down the valley. McGregor's dog hadn't been an isolated incident. More livestock had vanished, not just cattle, but sheep and goats, leaving behind trails of inexplicable destruction. But now, it wasn't just livestock. Domestic animals, too, were disappearing. Cats and small dogs, beloved family pets, were vanishing without a trace. When tracks were found, they were always the same: too large, too deep, too wrong. The fear in their voices was palpable, a shared understanding of a monstrous reality they couldn't articulate. One morning, Jonathan woke to an unnatural silence. No birdsong, no rustling in the trees. He stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun held loosely at his side. And there it was. Right on the worn wooden planks, directly in front of their front door, lay the large, lifeless body of a red fox. It wasn't torn apart or mauled. It was gutted. Its belly was slit open with surgical precision, its internal organs removed. But there wasn't a single drop of blood on the porch or on the fox itself. Its life essence had been siphoned away, leaving only an empty husk. The same sickening, metallic stench of decay wafted from the carcass, more potent than ever. Then he looked up. Nailed to the trunk of the massive pine tree overlooking their front yard at eye level was one of his trail cameras. The one he'd placed highest, the one he thought was perfectly concealed. Its lens had been ripped out, the wires mangled, but the camera itself was still intact, its broken eye pointing directly at their front door, at the spot where the eviscerated fox lay. It was a message, stark and unambiguous. A warning. They knew he was watching, and now they were letting him know they were watching back. The forest was whispering, and its words were filled with unspeakable malice. The sight of the eviscerated fox and the ruined camera was a cold, hard slap of reality. Jonathan knew then, with a chilling certainty, that he was utterly on his own. Sheriff Brody wouldn't help, wouldn't even understand. The scattered neighbors were too steeped in their own fear and denial to be of any use. Some had already left. They were alone against whatever monstrous intelligence stalked their woods. There was only one path left: fight. He began transforming their home into a fortress, a desperate bastion against the encroaching darkness. Every window on the ground floor, save for a single narrow observation slit in the kitchen, was boarded up with thick sheets of plywood and then covered with the heavy iron shutters he'd installed. He worked tirelessly, driven by a raw, primal need to protect his family. He reinforced the main entrance with a heavy oak beam, wedged tightly against the doorframe. Every ingress point was sealed, fortified, made to maximum impermeability. The house, once a symbol of peace and escape, now felt like a tomb, its interior plunged into a perpetual twilight. His hunting shed became a temporary arsenal. He meticulously gathered every single firearm he owned: the hunting carbine, a potent deer rifle, his well-worn pump-action shotgun loaded with buckshot and slugs, and his heavy revolver, a powerful handgun for close-quarters defense. He laid them out on the kitchen table, their cold, hard metal a stark contrast to the homey tablecloth. He cleaned and oiled each weapon with a grim, ritualistic care, checking every moving part, every sight, every spring. Stacked neatly beside them were thousands of rounds of ammunition, gleaming brass cartridges and dull gray shotgun shells, a grim testament to the scale of the threat. He also gathered anything that could serve as a weapon or tool for defense: 2 sharp axes from his woodpile, a heavy spade, a claw hammer, a sturdy crowbar. Every implement was placed strategically, within easy reach of the fortified positions he'd identified. The hardest part was talking to Sarah and Lisa. He sat them down in the dim living room, the single lamp casting long, flickering shadows, and told them not everything, but enough. He showed Sarah how to load the shotgun, how to chamber a round, how to aim and fire. The kick of the weapon making her flinch. Her hands trembled as she held it, her face pale. "John, what is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are we fighting?" He couldn't answer, could only look at her with an intensity that brooked no argument. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the absolute certainty that this was real, and slowly, reluctantly, she acquiesced. Lisa, usually so bright and effervescent, sat quietly, her small face serious, her eyes wide as she listened. He explained the plan, the fallback positions, the escape routes when the worst happened. He showed her how to stay low, how to be quiet, how to recognize the sounds he would make. He gave her a small, sharp hunting knife, not for fighting, but for desperate self-defense, instructing her simply, "When anyone gets in, Lisa, you run, you hide, and you don't come out until I tell you." Her small hand clutched the hilt, her knuckles white. She was terrified, but he saw a flicker of determination in her young eyes, a desperate will to survive that strengthened his own resolve. Around the house, Jonathan began setting up a series of crude, improvised early warning systems. He strung thin fishing line, barely visible, across the property lines and around the immediate perimeter, attaching small tinkling bells to them. Overturned metal buckets, carefully balanced, sat on the ground in strategic locations, designed to clatter loudly when disturbed. He even hammered a series of sharpened wooden stakes into the ground around the tree line, barely covered by fallen leaves, to provide a painful surprise and a precious few seconds of warning. Finally, he installed powerful motion sensor floodlights at each corner of the house, calibrated to bathe the yard in a blinding white light at the slightest movement. They flickered on every time a squirrel scampered by and when a gust of wind rustled the leaves. But Jonathan found a perverse comfort in their constant vigilance. The nights became an agonizing vigil. The creatures, emboldened by their previous forays, now moved with an unsettling arrogance. Their enormous, dark silhouettes were no longer fleeting glimpses, but clear, undeniable presences in the floodlights, their forms briefly illuminated before they melted back into the deeper shadows of the woods. The constant, unnerving sounds had escalated beyond simple growls. Now, Jonathan heard a chorus of low, guttural moans, a sickening scraping sound as their claws tested the hardened wood of the house, and sometimes a chilling, human-like whimper, a sound so distorted and pained it clawed at his sanity. They mocked him, called to him, their voices a grotesque parody of human speech. Jonathan felt a profound, crushing sense of defeat even as he fought. He saw the toll this ordeal was taking on his family. Sarah's face was perpetually pale, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep, her easy laugh replaced by a jumpiness that startled him. Lisa, once so full of innocent joy, now moved with a quiet, watchful trepidation, her small hands often clutched tightly to his pants leg. He felt himself shrinking, turning inward, becoming nothing more than a desperate animal protecting his young. He was cornered, trapped, but the thought of giving up, of surrendering them to these things, was worse than any death. He had to protect them. In his relentless search for any advantage, any escape route. Jonathan decided to make a thorough inspection of the house's old, earthen basement. He'd barely paid it any mind when he'd first bought the property, seeing it as just another dusty storage space. It was a dark, cramped area supported by rough-hewn wooden beams that smelled of damp earth and ancient mold. He took his brightest lantern, illuminating the shadowy corners. That's when he noticed it. A peculiar dampness permeated one corner, near the far wall. And with it, a faint but unmistakable presence of that putrid metallic smell. Not the overwhelming stench that drifted from the woods, but a deeper, more insidious odor, something rotten that had seeped into the very foundations of the earth itself, rising from below. This was the source, he now realized with a chilling certainty, the true origin of the miasma that had plagued them for months. He ran his hand along the rough stone and mortar of the foundation wall, feeling a cold, clammy moisture that vibrated with a silent, ancient malevolence. The source, he now realized, was not just outside. It was here, within the very heart of his home, a vast, hidden charnel pit. The air in the house was a thick, suffocating blanket of dread. Sleep had become a fleeting, fractured thing, snatched in fitful bursts, constantly on the alert for the smallest creak, the faintest rustle. Lisa, her small body curled into a permanent knot of anxiety, rarely left Sarah's side, her eyes red-rimmed and shadowed. Sarah herself was a spectral presence, her optimism replaced by a hollow-eyed terror, her hands constantly twisting, her gaze darting to every window, every shadowed corner. Jonathan, the self-appointed sentinel, felt the exhaustion seep into his bones, a profound weariness that went beyond mere physical exertion. His patrols around the house were constant, relentless, a desperate dance with the unseen, unheard threat. Every nerve ending was frayed, stretched taut like an old banjo string ready to snap. Then one night, the relative quiet shattered. It began with a single deafening impact against the outer wall of the house, directly opposite the living room. It wasn't a scratch or a thud. It was a colossal, bone-jarring blow, a sound of raw, destructive force that reverberated through the entire structure. The house bucked, groaning like a living thing, making the old wooden beams creak and groan in protest. Pictures on the walls jumped, plates in the kitchen cabinets rattled, and a small ceramic owl on the mantelpiece toppled to the floor, shattering into a dozen pieces. Jonathan snatched his shotgun from its ready position by the main door. "Stay here. Stay low." He barked at Sarah, his voice hoarse, adrenaline instantly flooding his system, chasing away the exhaustion. Another impact, and another. Something was hammering at the wall with an unbelievable, tireless ferocity, trying to smash its way through the thick log timbers. He crept to the reinforced observation slit he'd created in the living room wall, a narrow gap in the heavy shutters and plywood. He peered out, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The moonlight, filtered through a patchy cloud cover, offered only a dim, spectral glow. But it was enough. There, pressed against the wall, was an enormous, dark silhouette, vaguely bipedal. Its massive head lowered, slamming its powerful shoulders and a heavy, clawed fist against the logs. It was a creature of terrifying bulk and raw, brute strength. He couldn't make out fine details in the gloom, but the sheer size of it, the relentless, focused power of its attack, left no doubt. It was one of them. Its yellow eyes, like smoldering embers, glowed with an insane, focused rage. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He raised the shotgun, leveled it through the slit, and squeezed the trigger. The blast was deafening in the confined space, the recoil slamming back into his shoulder. The silhouette let out an unearthly, wounded roar, a sound of primal agony and fury that was physical in its impact. It recoiled violently from the wall, a blur of motion, and then vanished into the deeper shadows of the tree line, leaving behind only the echoing silence of its cry and the lingering smell of gunpowder and that metallic, putrid decay. For a brief, desperate moment, Jonathan felt a surge of triumph, believing he had truly harmed it. But the fleeting image of its colossal, retreating form, still moving with terrifying speed, immediately extinguished that hope. It was wounded, yes, but not stopped. Not even slowed significantly. The power of his shotgun, a weapon that could drop a charging bear, seemed barely an irritant to this monstrosity. Morning brought the cold light of day, but no real relief. The damage was stark and horrifying. In the thick log timbers of the living room wall, where the creature had attacked, there was a deep, jagged indentation, a foot across, stretching inwards. The wood was splintered, cracked, the fibers torn. A giant, invisible fist had tried to punch its way straight through. Another few blows, Jonathan knew, and it succeeded. On the dewy grass below the damaged wall, there were more clumps of the coarse black fur, thick and matted. But this time something new was mixed in. A faint coppery scent, the unmistakable metallic tang of fresh blood. He knelt, searching frantically, and found a small, leathery piece of skin, the size of his thumb, covered in the rough black fur, clearly torn from something living. He had hit it. He had actually wounded one of the creatures. A momentary surge of grim satisfaction flickered through him, quickly extinguished by a deeper, more chilling realization. There were only small splashes of blood on the grass, a few faint trails leading into the woods, quickly disappearing. No large pools, no gushing wound. Whatever this thing was, it was incredibly tough. A direct hit from a shotgun, loaded with buckshot, dropped any animal, even a bear, instantly. Yet this creature merely roared, recoiled, and vanished, its wound not fatal. The horrifying truth settled over Jonathan like a shroud. Their ordinary weapons, their hunting rifles and shotguns, were not enough. They were barely effective against these things. The creatures were not just strong, they were impervious. The fear that had been a dull ache in his stomach now exploded into raw, gut-wrenching terror. Sarah and Lisa saw the damaged wall, the splintered wood, the bloodied fur. Lisa, her eyes wide and haunted, buried her face in Sarah's side, trembling uncontrollably. Sarah stared at Jonathan, her face stark white, her lips parted in a silent scream. Her gaze, filled with an unbearable mix of fear, despair, and a profound, wordless question, asked, "What is this, John? What in God's name are we up against? And what are we going to do?" He saw the resolve in her eyes begin to crumble, the last vestiges of her strength draining away. And in that moment, Jonathan felt his own carefully constructed determination begin to fray, the cold tendrils of hopelessness starting to coil around his own heart. He tried to keep up his patrols, tried to project an air of control, but the constant gnawing feeling of being watched was becoming unbearable. It wasn't just at night now. Even in the harsh light of day, every time he stepped outside, even for a moment, he felt the invisible weight of eyes upon him. He saw them too, the new tracks. Not just random wanderings, but a deliberate perimeter. immense paw prints, too large for any known animal, too deep, stretching along the very edge of his property line. Fresh in the disturbed soil of a freshly tilled patch of garden, they were conducting a reconnaissance, an endless, patient surveillance. They were studying the house, studying them, learning their habits, their defenses. And with each passing day, the dread deepened, a cold, unshakable certainty that the siege had only just begun. The full-scale siege began 3 nights after Jonathan fired his shotgun. The air grew still and heavy, a suffocating blanket of quiet that pressed down on the entire clearing, muffling the usual chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. Then, as the last vestiges of twilight bled from the sky, the first howl rose, a long, drawn-out cry of unholy hunger that tore through the pre-darkness. It was answered by another, and then another, until the entire clearing was filled with a terrifying symphony of guttural growls, piercing shrieks, and that distorted human-like whimpering. Jonathan counted 5 distinct voices. A 6th soon joined, their collective sound a physical force that vibrated through the very foundation of the house, rattling every pane of glass, every nail in the wood. Downstairs. Now, Jonathan bellowed, his voice raw, grabbing his carbine. Sarah, clutching Lisa, moved with a speed born of pure terror, scrambling towards the main bedroom, their designated safe room. Jonathan had chosen it because it was the most interior room, with no direct outside walls, and he had reinforced its heavy oak door with additional bolts and a sturdy, hand-hewn crossbar. They barricaded it quickly, shoving a heavy dresser and a chest of drawers against the door, their hands trembling with haste. The assault was immediate and brutal. The creatures threw themselves against the house with a collective, terrifying force. The sound was deafening, the sickening crunch of wood, the splintering of panels, the groaning of the log walls as something massive slammed into them. Glass shattered in the living room, the iron shutters protesting loudly as they were battered and clawed. Jonathan could hear their furious breathing, a deep, raspy sound right outside the walls, mixed with their guttural snarls and the frantic scratching of their immense claws, seeking any purchase, any weakness. They were no longer testing. They were tearing. Jonathan moved to the small, fortified loophole he'd prepared in the bedroom, a narrow gap in the wall that allowed a limited field of fire. He peered out into the chaos. The floodlights, triggered by the creature's movements, flickered on and off, casting the yard in a strobe of blinding white light, and then plunging it back into oppressive shadow. In those fleeting moments of illumination, he saw them, hulking, muscled forms, moving with a frenetic, desperate energy, their yellow eyes burning like coals. He fired his carbine, the sharp crack of the rifle adding to the din, aiming for those glowing eyes, but the creatures were immune, absorbing the impact, merely snarling with renewed fury. The bullets, designed to tear through flesh and bone, seemed to merely glance off their hides, leaving only superficial wounds that infuriated them rather than incapacitated them. His weapons were useless, a futile gesture against their supernatural resilience. They were everywhere. He heard them on the roof, their heavy bodies thudding across the shingles, their claws scraping and tearing, dislodging loose timber. They were trying to get in from above, from below, from every angle, their purpose single-minded: entry. The sound of their heavy breathing, their low guttural growls, and that awful human whimpering penetrated the very wood of the walls, filling the small room with the stench of their wildness, the reek of fear, and the now familiar sickening smell of decay and something metallic. Lisa was beyond comforting. She was hysterical, her small body racked with shuddering sobs, her cries mixing with the monstrous din outside, making it impossible to tell where her terror ended and the creatures started. Sarah held her tightly, rocking her back and forth, trying to muffle her daughter's screams. But Sarah herself was a hair's breadth from breaking. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide and vacant with shock, her body trembling uncontrollably. Jonathan, his own face ashen and slick with sweat, gripped his rifle, his hands shaking, reloading with a desperate mechanical efficiency. The adrenaline coursed through him, a searing current, but it was overshadowed by a cold, suffocating fear for his family, a fear that threatened to paralyze him completely. In the midst of the terrifying assault, a new realization struck Jonathan cold and stark. Beneath the cacophony of breaking wood and monstrous roars, a familiar putrid smell began to intensify. It wasn't just drifting in from outside anymore. It was emanating from within the room, seeping up through the cracks in the old wooden floorboards. A deeper, more concentrated version of that metallic chemical decay. It mingled with the sharp tang of gunpowder, the sour scent of his own sweat, and the overwhelming reek of raw, primal terror. Then he noticed the pattern of the attack. Despite the general, overwhelming assault on all sides of the house, a significant portion of the creatures were concentrating their efforts on one specific area. Not the main door, not the living room windows, but the far wall of the bedroom, the wall that backed directly onto the small, earthen basement. He could hear a furious rhythmic pounding there, a relentless focused force, as something enormous dug its way through the very foundation. They were not trying to climb in, not just trying to batter their way through a window. They were excavating. A chilling clarity pierced through Jonathan's fear. They weren't just hunting them as prey. Not exactly. They weren't after their flesh, their blood, and their lives in the way a wolf hunted a deer. They were drawn by the smell. This house, their dream home, was a giant, irresistible lure, a beacon of death and decay, a colossal offering of ancient blood that permeated the very ground. For these creatures, the house was not just a structure, it was a larder, a reservoir of whatever dark essence they craved. They hadn't wanted to get to the family. They had wanted to get to this. The family had simply been an obstacle, an irritating presence guarding their desired prize. Jonathan now knew their motive. He understood the horrifying primal draw of his own home. But this knowledge, this terrible clarity, brought no comfort. Instead, it plunged him into an even deeper, more profound sense of desperation. Their situation was not merely dangerous, it was utterly hopeless. They were not just under siege. They were trapped in a charnel house, their only escape blocked by an unknown, unknowable horror driven by a hunger beyond comprehension. Jonathan returned from the basement, his face ashen, his skin clammy with sweat, the pervasive stench of the charnel pit clinging to his clothes and hair. He found Sarah and Lisa huddled together in the bedroom, their eyes fixed on the doorway, waiting. He collapsed onto the floor, unable to stand, and with a voice that was barely a whisper, he told Sarah everything he had found. Sarah listened, her face slowly draining of color, her eyes widening with a mix of shock, revulsion, and a profound, agonizing disappointment. Her dream of a peaceful life, their sanctuary, their new beginning. All of it had been built on a foundation of rot, on a gruesome hidden graveyard. The knowledge that their home was not a refuge but a sickening lure, a constant invitation for the monstrous, was too much to bear. Her optimism, her resilience, finally shattered under the weight of this grotesque truth. She stared at him, tears silently tracking paths down her grimy cheeks, a wordless accusation in her gaze. "We can't stay here," she choked out, her voice raw. "We can't." But Jonathan knew with a terrible, icy clarity that they couldn't simply leave either. The creatures had marked them. They had focused their attention on this house, on the family within it. To simply walk out, unarmed and exposed, into the surrounding forest would be suicide. The wilderness that had once offered solace was now an enemy, teeming with shadows and unseen threats. And where would they go? The sheriff wouldn't believe them. The few scattered neighbors were too frightened to help. Some had already departed. They were pariahs, chased from their home, with no safe haven, no one to turn to. They were, in the most literal sense, utterly and hopelessly alone. A cold, grim resolve, born of desperation, settled over Jonathan. To get rid of the creatures, they had to destroy the source of their obsession. The beacon had to be extinguished. The house, their home, had to be destroyed. Not just the physical structure, but the very earth beneath it. The blood-soaked foundations that had drawn the monsters in for decades. Only by burning it all to the ground, by erasing the beacon entirely, they severed the tie that bound these things to them. He laid out his plan for Sarah, a plan so brutal, so utterly unthinkable, that the words themselves felt like acid on his tongue. They would set the house on fire, a controlled burn. While the flames consumed the blood-soaked earth and the burning structure distracted the creatures, they would attempt to make their escape into the chaos using the fire as cover. Sarah recoiled as he had struck her. "Burn it? Our home? No, John. We can't. This is all we have." Her voice was a desperate shriek, laced with horror and disbelief. But Jonathan met her gaze, his own eyes burning with a terrible, unwavering certainty. "It's not our home, Sarah. It's a tomb. It's a trap. And it's the only way." He didn't try to persuade her with logic. He simply showed her the depth of his own despair, the absolute conviction that this was their sole monstrous chance at survival. Slowly, agonizingly, Sarah's resistance crumbled, replaced by a grim, silent acceptance. She saw the truth in his eyes. Jonathan moved with a frantic, methodical energy. He emptied the fuel tank from his lawnmower, pouring the gasoline into several 5-gallon jerry cans he kept in the shed. He found an old kerosene heater and siphoned its contents. He gathered anything flammable, stacks of old newspapers, bundles of dry kindling he'd chopped for the fireplace, old rags, even a bottle of lighter fluid. He meticulously placed these materials, creating an intricate network of fire trails, leading from the main floor down into the basement, ensuring that once ignited, the flames would spread quickly and devastatingly, consuming the core of the problem first. He felt like a madman, systematically destroying everything he had built, everything he had worked for. But beneath the horror, there was a grim sense of purpose. While he worked, Sarah and Lisa, moving like automatons, gathered their most precious, indispensable possessions. Documents, birth certificates, their marriage license, the deed to the property now destined for ash, a small, water-stained photo album, a handful of cash from Sarah's emergency fund, the warmest coats, and a single change of clothes each. Every other item, every piece of furniture, every trinket, every memory embodied in their belongings had to be left behind. Lisa, her face swollen with tears, clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit, a worn and faded toy she'd had since infancy. "But my dollhouse, Daddy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My books?" Jonathan could only shake his head, his own throat tight with unshed tears. This wasn't just the destruction of a house. It was the annihilation of a dream, a brutal severing of their future. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, the tension in the house became unbearable. They knew the creatures would return with the full darkness. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the wind outside, sounded like a harbinger of doom. Jonathan took Sarah and Lisa up to the cramped, dusty attic. He showed them the small dormer window, barely large enough for them to squeeze through, that opened onto the back roof. "When something went wrong," he instructed, his voice low and firm, "when I could not get you out from downstairs, you climb out here. Go over the roof, down the back, and run for the river. Don't look back. Don't stop." Sarah nodded, her face grim. Lisa, clutching her rabbit, simply stared at the small, dusty window, her innocent eyes filled with a terror that ripped at Jonathan's heart. The waiting was the worst part, each minute stretching into an eternity, counting down to the moment they would set their lives, their future, ablaze. As the last sliver of twilight vanished, surrendering the world to the inky blackness of a moonless night, the creatures returned. There was no hesitation this time, no probing, no stealth. Their presence was immediate, overwhelming, a wave of raw, malevolent energy that crashed against the house. Their howls, a chorus of primal fury and ravenous hunger, tore through the stillness, shaking the very foundations of the earth. The scratching and battering began instantly. With a renewed, desperate intensity, their collective rage a tangible force that vibrated through the reinforced walls. They were no longer testing. They were attacking with a singular, murderous intent. Jonathan moved with a grim, practiced efficiency. He'd prepared for this. "Stay here, stay low," he yelled over the din, ushering Sarah and Lisa into the main bedroom, their designated safe haven. He grabbed a couple of old glass bottles he'd filled with gasoline and rags, improvised incendiary devices. With a deep breath, he pulled the pins on his carefully set tripwires near the front and side of the house. As the floodlights flickered on, momentarily illuminating the monstrous forms, Jonathan launched the bottles through the broken windows, sending them arcing over the creatures' heads. They smashed against the far walls of the house, away from the basement, erupting into immediate, hungry flames that licked up the wooden siding. The creatures shrieked, a sound of pain and outrage, as the fire flared. Part of the pack, drawn by the new burning focus, veered off, clawing at the spreading flames, their attention momentarily diverted from the basement wall. It was a desperate gamble, but it bought Jonathan the precious few seconds he needed. With a final desperate prayer, Jonathan descended into the putrid darkness of the basement. The air was thick, suffocating, a nauseating mix of the ancient metallic decay and the sharp, acrid fumes of gasoline. He could hear the creatures still pounding furiously at the breached wall above, their growls vibrating through the very earth beneath his feet. Right there, just inches from him. Through the ragged hole they had torn, he could see brief, horrifying flashes of their yellow eyes, burning with an insane fury. He could feel their hot, rancid breath seeping through the gaps, heavy and rank. His hands, trembling not just from fear but from the enormity of what he was about to do, moved with a horrifying purpose. He doused the grotesque pile of bones and decaying flesh with the last of the gasoline, saturating the ancient grave, ensuring a thorough, cleansing burn. The wooden beams, already soaked, would act as kindling. He took out a box of matches, his thumb fumbling with the tiny wooden stick. The scratching sound of the match head against the strike pad was deafening in the charged silence of the basement. A tiny spark. A fragile flame. He dropped the match. The explosion was immediate, a roaring whoosh of hungry fire that instantly consumed the darkness. Flames erupted. A blinding orange inferno that greedily swallowed the bones, the rotting flesh, the very air itself. The putrid stench of decay was instantly overwhelmed by the acrid, choking smell of burning wood and gasoline. A cleansing fire that consumed everything in its path. The basement became a raging furnace, the heat intense, immediate, pressing in on him, driving him back. As the fire took hold, a new sound erupted from outside. The creature's howls rose to an unbearable, ear-splitting crescendo of absolute fury and agony. It was no longer just anger. It was a howl of profound, gut-wrenching pain, of a primal agony as their sacred, ancient beacon was consumed. They slammed into the house with redoubled force, a desperate, frenzied attack, trying to get at the source of the fire, trying to extinguish the cleansing flames that devoured their prize. Jonathan could hear them screaming their rage, some of their monstrous forms visible through the fire-lit gaps, even attempting to beat their way through the raging inferno, their hides momentarily illuminated by the hellish glow. Jonathan scrambled out of the basement, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut behind him. The roaring sound of the fire and the screams of the creatures rising from below. He barely made it. The flames were already spreading with terrifying speed, devouring the wooden floors, racing up the walls, consuming everything in their path. Smoke, thick and black, billowed through the house, stinging his eyes, filling his lungs. Wooden beams groaned and cracked. The glass in the remaining windows buckled and exploded with sharp, violent pops, adding to the terrifying cacophony of destruction. The house, their home, was rapidly transforming into a raging, fiery tomb. He raced up the stairs, the heat intensifying with every step, the smoke now a suffocating cloud. Sarah and Lisa were waiting on the attic landing, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes wide with fear. The fire was already licking at the lower steps, the heat radiating up, unbearable. The window. Jonathan gasped, his voice raw from the smoke. He pushed open the small dormer window that led out onto the roof. The blast of fresh, cold night air was a momentary reprieve from the inferno below. Coughing, choking, feeling the intense heat on their backs, they squeezed through the narrow opening, one by one, emerging onto the sloping shingles of the roof, the roaring flames already towering behind them. The house was now a blazing pyre, consuming itself, devouring their past, and offering a desperate, terrifying path to their future. From the precarious perch on the roof, Jonathan, Sarah, and Lisa watched in horrified awe as their home transformed into a roaring infernal beacon. Flames leaped skyward, orange and red tendrils clawing at the night, casting a monstrous, dancing light across the surrounding forest. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning wood and the choking metallic tang of smoke. The sound was deafening. The guttural roar of the fire, the explosive pops of breaking glass, the groaning, splintering collapse of wooden beams. The walls, the very structure of their dreams, buckled, and then, with a thunderous crack, began to cave inward, plunging into the heart of the fiery abyss below. The house was a pyre, consuming itself, reducing everything they had built to ash and smoke. Below, around the perimeter of the burning inferno, the creatures were a chaotic, maddened blur of motion. Their howls, now laced with a raw, agonizing fury, were unbearable, sounds of ultimate violation and pain. They raced around the perimeter of the blazing structure, their enormous silhouettes dancing in the demonic glow of the flames, some of them actually throwing themselves against the radiating heat, their forms briefly illuminated like demons from hell, before recoiling with renewed screams of rage. They clawed at the ground, at the burning timbers, their purpose clear. They were trying to get to their sacred burning larder, but the searing heat was too intense, the inferno too vast. Now, Jonathan yelled, his voice raw, barely audible over the roar of the fire. He quickly secured the rope he'd fashioned from tightly braided bed sheets to the sturdy chimney, testing its strength with a desperate pull. Sarah went first, her face streaked with tears and soot, her small hands clumsy with fear as she gripped the rope. Jonathan guided her over the edge, slowly lowering her down the steep incline of the roof, his muscles screaming with the effort. She slid down, scraping her hands and face on the rough shingles, landing with a jarring thud on the singed grass below. Then came Lisa. Jonathan tied the rope securely around her small waist, reassuring her with a shaky voice. "Just like we practiced, honey. Just like a fire drill." He lowered her gently, her small body trembling, her eyes wide with terror. But she followed his instructions, her survival instinct kicking in. She slid down the rope, crying softly, her small hands raw and scraped before falling onto the ground next to her mother. Finally, Jonathan. He threw his shotgun down first, watching it land with a dull thud. Then, with a last, desperate look at the inferno that had been his home, he swung over the edge, rappelling down the rope. The heat from the burning house intense against his back, the smoke burning his lungs. He landed hard, stumbling, his own hands and face stinging from minor burns and abrasions. "Run!" he gasped, grabbing Sarah and Lisa, pulling them forward. They stumbled away from the radiating heat, away from the collapsing inferno, plunging into the deeper, merciful shadows of the surrounding forest. The roar of the fire faded behind them, slowly receding, replaced by the crackling of burning wood and the increasingly distant, desperate howls of the enraged creatures. Jonathan risked a glance over his shoulder. He saw them, the monstrous forms, still circling the perimeter of the now smoldering ruins, their fury slowly giving way to confusion, to a frustrated, mournful rage. Their interest in the burning house, in their destroyed beacon, waned as the last of the flames consumed the source of their obsession. One by one, their hulking forms melted back into the deeper shadows of the woods, disappearing into the vast, indifferent darkness, as if they never existed. A strange, bitter wave of relief washed over Jonathan. They were alive. They had survived. The house, their beautiful cursed home, was gone, reduced to a smoking ruin, but it had also been their prison. now, they were free. Free from the constant, gnawing dread. Free from the insidious pull of that ancient buried curse. He pulled Sarah and Lisa close, wrapping his arms around them, his own body trembling from exhaustion and the lingering shock. "It's over," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, trying to convince himself as much as them. "It's over. We're safe now." They walked, stumbled really, through the dense undergrowth, guided by the distant pale glow of the setting moon. Every shadow leaped and twisted, every rustle of leaves sending a fresh jolt of fear through them. But the immediate primal terror had receded, replaced by a profound weariness. They pushed on, heading blindly in the general direction of the distant, barely discernible lights of the town, not knowing where they would go, what they would do. The feeling of pure, unadulterated survival mingled with an aching, gut-wrenching grief for everything they had lost, for the dream that had turned into a nightmare. Their future was an empty, terrifying blank slate, but for now, for this moment, they were alive. The first slivers of dawn were painting the eastern sky in bruised purples and blood oranges as the family finally stumbled onto a neighboring ridge. Their clothes were torn and singed, their faces and hands streaked with soot and ash, raw from the smoke and exertion. But they were alive. Jonathan pulled Sarah and Lisa close, their small family a tableau of exhausted survival against the harsh beauty of the breaking day. Below them, in the valley, a thin column of white smoke curled lazily upwards, marking the spot where their home had stood. All that remained was a charred skeleton of timber, a smoking crater, a testament to the night's fiery baptism. Jonathan felt a profound emptiness in his gut, a grief for everything lost, for the dream that had turned to ash. But beneath it, a flicker of hard-won victory. He had saved his family. He had faced down the unspeakable, had destroyed the ancient beacon that drew the monsters. He clung to the conviction that the nightmare was finally over, that the price they had paid, the utter destruction of their home and their past, was enough. They had paid in full. He looked out over the vast, silent expanse of the forest, seeking nothing but the serene, indifferent wilderness. But then, his gaze snagged on something. In the distance, on the crest of another, higher hill, a mile away, 4 dark figures had appeared. They stood motionless, stark silhouettes against the rapidly brightening sky, like statues carved from shadow. They were unmistakable, too tall, too gaunt, too predatory. They were watching. A cold dread began to seep into Jonathan's heart, slowly at first, then rapidly expanding, tightening its icy grip. Their focus was not on the smoking ruins below, not on the destroyed beacon. Their collective, unblinking gaze was directed straight at him, at Sarah, at Lisa. He knew it with a chilling certainty that went beyond mere sight. He could feel it, a palpable weight of malevolent attention. One of the creatures, the largest one, slowly raised a clawed hand. In its grasp, held aloft, was an object. Jonathan squinted, his breath catching in his throat. His blood ran cold, turning to ice in his veins. It was one of his surveillance cameras, the one he had painstakingly hidden in the large pine tree near the house. It was mangled, its lens ripped out, the plastic housing cracked, but it was unmistakably his. And in the center of its broken frame, despite the destruction, a tiny red indicator light was still blinking, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the vast, indifferent morning, a mocking symbol of its continued active presence, like an unblinking eye, recording. Not actually recording, Jonathan knew, with a fresh wave of despair, but powered on, a deliberate message, a macabre trophy. The realization hit Jonathan with the force of a physical blow, a terror so profound it threatened to paralyze him. The house, the charnel pit beneath it, had been merely a distraction, a source of sustenance, a scent that drew them in. But they were more than just mindless predators driven by instinct. They were intelligent. They were sentient. They had recognized the threat. They had seen him. They had watched him set the fire, had seen him destroy their ancient larder. And they had taken his camera, a trophy, a message. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had only just begun. They were not merely seeking a meal and a putrid smell. They remembered. They knew. And now, he, Jonathan, was their target. He had become their new beacon, drawing not their hunger, but their cold, calculating hatred, their thirst for retribution. He was no longer just the protector. He was the primary target, the cause of their ancient pain. He pulled Lisa to him, clutching her small, trembling body against his eyes fixed on the distant, unmoving silhouettes. The sun was fully risen now, washing the landscape in a golden light that felt profoundly, ironically, beautiful. But for Jonathan, it was merely the dawn of an unending hunt. The battle for their lives had just begun, and this time it would be far more personal, far more relentless, and far more desperate than anything he ever imagined. There was no escape, only flight. And a desperate, unending struggle against an enemy that knew their faces and would never forget.